Welcome to mini lecture 5 for module 2. In this short lecture I'm going to introduce the concept of world regions as we discuss them in the class, and I want to challenge you to think about why our regions are defined the way they are. So let's begin. What I want you to think about is what are the aspects of world regions as the class defines them, and do they make sense? And are there things today that are beginning to make these borders, if you will, between regions more transition zones, and perhaps maybe these regions are beginning to change? So I want you to think about three aspects of world regions that we might challenge. First of which is political frameworks, that is, how are political entities related across these regions? Do regions have a cohesive common characteristic politically, or do they not? How are international relationships of different sorts pulling regions together, reframing them, or pulling them apart? And then how important are the cultural traits? These things that we'll get to in a later lecture, this idea of culture, and do regions really exist primarily because of cultural characteristics? Okay, so let's take a couple looks, let's take a look at a couple of these maps. First of all, your text talks about the idea of unitary states and federal states. And this might be one way of dividing the world. Remember that unitary states, these are important definitions for the quiz. A unitary state is a state where the central government really has almost all of the control. And we can think about this in terms of many of the African states and many of the Southeast Asian and East Asian states. In those cases, what you see is a central government, in the case of China, that has a great deal of control of what goes on in each of the other political subdivisions. Now, I want to put that in contrast to the United States, which is a federal state. It's interesting to note that the United States and Russia are really both federal states. And what that means is that the political entity, the country, is divided into units, each of which has a great deal of autonomy, a great deal of central power within each of the individual states. So if you want to think about that, in China, central government runs everything. In the United States, Iowa's government, or Indiana's government, or Ohio's government really controls what's going on in that state. It can set its own laws. Each state has its own constitution, and that constitution may, in fact, be quite distinct from the federal constitution. And so when we think about these things, that's one way of dividing the earth. But what we can see very quickly from this map is that it doesn't really follow any of our regions that we think about. Certainly North America is like that, but so is Mexico. Only half of South America is that way. It's got an east to west divide. Some of Africa is, some of Africa isn't. A lot of Asia is unitary, but not all. India is one of the largest federal, in fact it is the largest in terms of population, federal state. So that doesn't quite work. Now, what about economic regions? Well, what you see here are all of the major trading and economic organizations in the world as they kind of exist today. For example, you'll see NAFTA. We are part of the North American Free Trade Agreement. The European Union, with all of its complexities going on with Brexit. You have the African Union. You have the Asian, the ASEAN region. Each of these are trade blocs that allow for trade and economic activity to go on very, very smoothly. And when you look at the map this way, well, we get some interesting breaks that seem to make a little bit more sense, except that in this case, notice this area here that really bridges parts of Europe and of Asia. And then you have the South Asian economic group that very strongly divides here. And that doesn't really make sense. We also see the Arab League. Well, that makes sense, and it divides Africa into its North African, Southwest Asian parts and into the Sub-Saharan group. So economics begins to make our regions make a little bit more sense. There's a few areas where it doesn't quite work, but economics seems to be pretty important and pretty consistent. Now, I can take that one step further and formalize it. This is actually how the World Bank, the largest kind of economic, global economic organization, sees the world. And you'll notice that when they talk about the world, they see it very clearly. They put Europe all the way across Russia and into the former Soviet states, and they very clearly divide South Asia from East Asia. Although the East Asian complex that the World Bank sees is Asia Pacific. And so that makes for some odd kind of combinations in terms of culture. All right, now, militarily. I do want to at least throw this in there. What we see in terms of military alliances is something that's very, very different. One of the things that you'll see here, at least in terms of the major organizations, is that the Collective Security Treaty Organization, essentially the outgrowth largely of the Soviet era, remains. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, exists. And then we have the U.S. Mutual Defense Treaties, and those exist with countries essentially along the Asia-Pacific rim. And so this is a very kind of dividing the world into two spheres. So it doesn't really work as a region, but it does have an influence. Now, when we end then with this, what I want you to think about as you look through the text is whether perhaps there's another factor, and that's going to be the issue of culture that we'll see in 2 lectures from here. That's it for this lecture. Again, I simply want you to think about whether the regions make sense. We'll see you next time.